Now we're going to dig into the article and find out more details about this joke, why, and I use joke in air quotations, this joke and why it was funny in the 18th century, and how it's a way for the apprentices to make fun of their master. I realize I've missed marking a section earlier, so I'm going to add that in now. So pause the video, read through this first section right here, this first paragraph, and then rejoin me. Here, Darnton is giving us some of the context and some of the limitations of his sources. So I'm going to make a note of that. So limitations of the primary source. And I'm also going to highlight a few key ideas here. We cannot observe this. Our information is coming to us only through Contat's narrative, which, as we already know from when we skimmed the conclusion, that it's written after the fact. It's quasi-fictional autobiography. It is part of a larger tradition of autobiographies. That's fine. We don't need to know the names there. This is interesting because printers, or at least compositors, and those are the people who put the text together in the printing press, and again, Google if you're not sure, had to be literate. They were among the few artisans who could give their own accounts of life in the working class. This is a particular person's version of what is happening. So even though this is a fictionalized telling of an event, Darnton tells us, don't be put off by that. We can still use it. We can treat this narrative as a fiction or a meaningful fabrication, a meaningful story. And using that, we can develop an ethnological explanation. We can study the dynamics, the culture, the community of the printer apprentices and their masters. On to the next section. And he says, the first explanation. So that word first is actually kind of important here because that tells us there's going to be more. So the first explanation that would probably occur is that the cat massacre served as an attack on the master and his wife, an indirect attack. And Darnton goes on to tell us and to talk about how the cats and the apprentices and the masters all fit into a hierarchy. So although the apprentices seemed most abused, the text makes it clear that the killing of the cats expressed a hatred for the bourgeois. Now, he says, and again, looking at those very important first sentences, historians have tended to treat the era of artisanal manufacture, so pre-industrial, as an idyllic period before the onset of industrialization. So if historians are treating this era, have a tendency to treat this era as idyllic, then why are the apprentices so upset with their masters? And that's what he asks here. So now he's going into talk about the conditions. Okay. There's a lot of numbers and dates in here, but thinking back to why we're reading the article, we don't need to worry about those numbers and dates. Okay. The general idea that we can see here is that there were fewer shops with larger workforces. And this trend made it virtually impossible for journeymen to rise to the rank of masters. The journeymen also felt threatened from below because the masters tended increasingly to hire alloués, or underqualified printers who had not undergone the apprenticeship that made a journeyman. So this is the context in which Contat is writing. Darnton moves into talking about a broader context. He brings in primary sources from Switzerland. to help support what he's saying. So I'm going to skim through this. And the general idea here is that working conditions were volatile. They changed very quickly. There were issues with absenteeism. All right. Now, since he's talking about a different source other than the story that we're dealing with, I just want to mark this visually for myself. So I'm just going to draw a line down there and a line down here, just so I know that that's context information that the author is using to support his argument. As always, beginning and ending of sections and paragraphs. Journeymen and masters may have lived together as members of a happy family at some time, but not at this time. So Contat had believed that an idyllic state had once existed. So this is his bias that he's coming to here. And again, beginning and ends of paragraphs are often where we find those key sentences. The boys, the apprentices, wanted to restore a mythical past when masters and the apprentices worked together. And that's why they killed the cats, or the cat killing is part of that. But why cats? So that's a clue that the author is going to change sections. So now we're going to go into, I guess it's section 3 now, and I'm going to walk you through this section, and then we're going to leave a section or two at the end or towards the end for you to work through on your own. So now in this section, from the first sentence, we can see that our attention is turning to folklore and ceremonies to understand the importance and significance of cats. And he mentions 2 in particular. I want to highlight these in a different color. The cycle of Carnival and Lent. So as we read through here, he gives us some of the details about Carnival and how cats might fit into it. So I'll make a little note here. And then the role of cats in Carnival. Then he mentions that cats also figured in the cycle of Saint John the Baptist, Saint Jean Baptiste, which took place on June 24th at the summer solstice. So here he introduces the festivities around Saint John the Baptist, why and how cats connect to that festivity, to that festival. All right, and I do recognize that these are difficult to read, so if you need to take a break, you can do that. Darton then goes on to talk about how, in addition to these general ceremonies that were celebrated by everyone, there were particular ceremonies celebrated by communities of artisans. So printers, he says, celebrated a feast in honor of St. John the Evangelist on December 27th and on May 6th. Okay, so this is number 3. I'm going to number this, and I'll go back and number the others as well. Then we have a lengthy description of the events of the celebration. And it's a very long description. So we're going to skim through it and just see if there's any information here that we think is going to be key information as opposed to detail. All right, so here he's talking about the rites of passage that an apprentice has to go through. And I'm not going to note the details here. I'm just going to note that there's a series of rites of passages that are related to this festival. And he gives us quite a lot of detail about these. So we're just going to skim through it. So what he's talking about here are the hazing and conditions that Jerome, Contat's main character, is depicted as going through. Darton notes the hazing and conditions that Jerome, Contat's main character, goes through to become an apprentice, but he warns us not to take it too seriously because of the way he deals with it. Contat deals with the subject matter. Our important thing here is that it's a transitional stage that he's going through. All right. So towards the end of the section, the author kind of zooms out on his argument again, and he provides us with one of those wonderful rich statements here. In entering the estate, so in entering the club of printers, Jerome assimilated an ethos. He identifies himself with a craft. Now, in our next section, Darton moves on to talk about cats. And this is where I'm going to leave you to work out the next two sections yourself, remembering our strategies of looking at the beginnings and ends and paying close attention there, and deciding what detail is important. Don't get bogged down in the details, because not every detail is necessary for our reading.